Moderator is Moira Weigel. She is a BKC faculty associate and an assistant professor of comparative literature here at Harvard. She writes and teaches about the history, theory, and social life of media and communication technologies from the early 19th century to the present. She originally trained in comparative literature and film studies, working in German, French, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. More recently, she has focused on data-driven technologies, particularly social media and marketplace platforms, as well as on new developments in artificial intelligence and machine translation. And last but not least, our speaker, Glen Weyl. Glen is founder and research lead at Microsoft Research's Plural Technology Collaboratory, co-founder and chair of the Plurality Institute, co-founder of Radical Exchange Foundation, and co-founder of the Faith and Technology Network. Weyl collaborates closely with technology leaders like Audrey Tang and others. He is co-authored, the influential book Radical Markets, and he also has a book that he's brought here today, The Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Glen. Thank you. Let's give it up for Glen.
So today what I want to talk about is how to actualize a alternative vision for what superintelligence is about. So rather than thinking about superintelligence as a big machine, I want us to instead think about it like this, like the Gaia idea of James Lovelock, that the planet, its ecosystems, the life inside of it, and the human-constructed things together constitute a partially, maybe eventually increasingly self-aware collective intelligence. And this contrasts to the usual vision that is presented of there's the machine that ingests a bunch of stuff and then autonomously goes off and does stuff. We compare its performance in terms of what it can do maximally separate from people in competition with a human alternative. That's like the Turing test vision. And you know, the alternative, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Wild Robot or read the books associated with it. So this is a book, and Moira made me promise not to give any spoilers, but she's reading it with her kids. But it's a book about a robot who ends up engaging in care and collective action relationships with a natural environment. And allowing them through that to resist the very logic of sort of corporate efficiency and top-down control that was initially programmed into the robot itself. You know, in this perspective, superintelligence is already all around us. Corporations, democracies, religions, cultures, all of these things manifest capabilities that humans do not have on their own across a wide range of things. And yet we think of the artificial superintelligence as something unique. Instead, I'm suggesting that it is another way that allows us to map human social relationships and thereby extend them. Now, why has this paradigm been so, submerged relative to the paradigm of autonomous human competition? The reason I would argue is that a lot of the concepts that would be critical to make technical progress on building an interactive sociotechnical system that exhibits sort of collective self-consciousness are drawn from fields like Moira's or sociology, anthropology, et cetera, that have a challenge making contact with computable objects that computer scientists can actuate. And I'm a recovering economist. I used to be an economist, and I've been in recovery for almost a decade now. But I still do think there's one thing useful from that heritage, which is that economics tends to be quite good at sort of doing what I would call translational formalism, which is to take abstract concepts that are hard to compute over from fields like sociology and anthropology and to translate them into things that can be targets for optimization. And today I'm going to try to do a little bit of that. Now, I don't think I really have enough time to do the two-way translation, which is what I was hoping for, but I will go through one example of this and maybe allude to a second. And the first one is this notion of common knowledge. So common knowledge is a game theoretic, economic theory concept that takes sort of ideas of community that are very important in sociology and communications and tries to turn them into an information theoretic formalism, which then could be a target for systems design. The other thing is that there's this neural network idea that some of you may be aware of that's become quite influential in computer science. And it's usually interpreted by an analogy to the human brain. But I want to argue actually that it can be maybe more fruitfully interpreted by an analogy to human production and democratic governance systems. And I don't think I'm going to get to that, but you feel free to ask me questions about it later. Let me talk about the issue of common knowledge. Okay, so what is community? On the one hand, my 6-year-old daughter's civics textbook that she's been reading defines community as the set of people sharing some geographic space and interacting with each other. There's something to that. There's definitely a stickiness of the notion that we only have real community in shared physical space. On the other hand, there's a massive amount of literature from social theory about how online interactions might constitute community, and how many of the most important communities are actually those that are imagined beyond the bounds of physical space that most people have traversed, like nations. So clearly there is something about community that is more easily or better achieved while sharing a physical space. And yet it appears that there's also some possibility that it could exist in a shared information space that doesn't need to be purely physically grounded. So what might be a candidate for satisfying that role? There's this literature in game theory and economics about common knowledge. So what is common knowledge? Common knowledge is things that not only do I know, but that I know that, and I know that I know, and so on. And this concept, I would argue, plays a fundamental role in literature. So perhaps the best illustration is the Emperor's New Clothes. So the notion is that everybody is aware that the emperor is naked, but they're afraid to laugh at him or point anything out because they think that other people maybe don't think this, or they think other people think that someone else doesn't think this. And then upon a child laughing and creating a shared public signal that everyone sees, that everyone's seeing, they're able to act on this. And this is a very fundamental notion in modern social science that is influenced by game theory, both in concept but also in application. The notion of common knowledge is foundational to how social scientists now understand most forms of collective action. So like, why are protests so much more catalytic than an even more broadly distributed pamphlet in creating revolution? The notion is that a protest, because it's in public, catalyzes collective action in a way that a pamphlet that people don't know who else has received would not. And this, in fact, is a very fundamental theory behind the way in which the Chinese Communist Party exercises social control. So there's a bunch of literature, including by some scholars here at Harvard, that shows that actually the Great Firewall is less important to Chinese social control than is the attempt to polarize and distract formations of common understanding in online spaces. Because even if information gets in, if it's constantly undermined by distraction or polarization, there's no ability to create the common knowledge necessary for collective action. And in fact, many would argue that effectively something very similar is happening in the Western environment, maybe possibly partly through foreign influence campaigns, that there's become a sort of meta misunderstanding that while people disagree with each other and maybe are polarized, actually even more, they misperceive what other people think about them, and even more misperceive how other people perceive them. And that sort of the higher you go in this hierarchy of beliefs, the worse the polarization gets. And that correlates very strongly with toxicity of polarization. But there's a place called Taiwan that had to deal with some of these attacks, but that had a democratic ecosystem that pushed back against them and developed tools to counter this dynamic. There's something called vTaiwan. In English, it's called Polis. And what this does is it has a social media-like interface, but then it clusters opinion, and you can see the representative opinions of the different opinion clusters, and then also see the things that bridge the divides across those clusters, things that are agreed to across the clusters despite the things they disagree on. And this is a vaccine or a cure for a polarization attack. And this concept has become quite widely used. It was the foundation for what became community notes on X, and now is spread to the rest of the ecosystem. Community notes is used on almost all of the major social media platforms now. However, there's some major limitations to community notes. In particular, it doesn't give any incentive for creating those notes. By the way, I should explain what community notes is, just in case people don't know. Community notes is a system on X where people, instead of being fact-checked from the top down, people can contribute notes that they think contextualize the original post. And the system under which those are displayed or not displayed permanently attached to the post is based on diverse approval. So people are clustered into different political positions, and then if there's agreement across those different political positions that this is a useful note, then it is displayed. But the problem is people don't have any incentive to write these notes. It doesn't affect the actual ranking of content, and it's in tension with the business model, which is driven by engagement-based advertising. What we've proposed in work with Audrey Tong, who is the digital minister of Taiwan, who innovated a lot of the systems that helped heal that environment, as well as a number of other collaborators, is a system in which rather than just affecting this note giving, basically every post would have contextualizing information about the social communities that someone's a part of, where that information or content is consensual and widely accepted, and the communities they're a part of where it might be dissensual or conflictual. And then have the ability to navigate through those communities to alternative perspectives on in that community on that topic. And that would be driven by some of these algorithms I just described, but tailored to different communities. So rather than just one global thing that's all driven by politics, there might be debates within Harvard, debates within the Catholic Church, debates within blah, blah, blah. And those would show up in terms of like logos down at the bottom of the post representing each of those communities, with either a green circle meaning that it's widely accepted in that community, or a red circle indicating that it's a source of contention there. And then the communities themselves would become core to the business model. So rather than advertisers or subscriptions being the only drivers of the business model, communities would actually pay to have their communities be healed and to have content that brings their community together or that gives contrasting perspectives within their community highlighted within the feed of their consenting members. This is also a potential paradigm for dealing with a lot of the issues around chatbots. So we know that chatbots have a tendency either to be like hyper-personalized and sycophantic and helping people escape into either a moral or informational bubble, or to be hyper, top-down controlled and universalistic. And what we suggest instead is that the bot might keep track of communities that you chose to be a member of, give you a perspective that is widely accepted within a leading community that you're a part of, and then also make you aware that there might be other communities that you're a part of where there might be other perspectives on this and that would allow you to navigate. So for example, asked a question about abortion, it might, if you're a devout Catholic, give you the Catholic perspective on abortion and say, however, this Catholic perspective is controversial within the United States, and within the Harvard community, would you like to know what other people think within those communities on this topic? Now, this also has the potential to aid in hallucination. So there's very good work showing that if you have quantitatively defined ground truth, actually you can completely eliminate hallucinations from models. However, the problem is that truth is socially defined, not externally defined, and that's undermined the ability to create a quantitative target that allows for that elimination of hallucinations. If you had a less ambitious goal of giving culturally relevant information rather than absolute truth, it might be possible to, at least within that context, eliminate that hallucination problem. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just very briefly give you a taste of the next thing and then conclude. So that took a formalism from sociology about community and tried to translate it into a target for optimization. You can also take a neural network and try to translate it into a social system. And it actually turns out, can anyone tell me what this is? Anyone know? So to my knowledge, this is the oldest diagram drawn by human hands that looks like a recombinant neural network. And it was from the 13th century in Venice. And it represents the way in which they voted for the Doge by people electing members of multiple committees that each elected members of multiple committees that eventually chose the Doge. And in fact, also, the earliest analytic work that was done on stuff like neural networks actually modeled it as a way of understanding firm relationships among the supply chain. And so I believe that this suggests that actually we should consider neural networks to be a map of political and economic relationships rather than of some external brain. And that if we treat it as such, there's a way to actually incorporate humans and ecological features into the training process of the network so that people are rewarded and recognized and able to control not global alignment, but the culturally relevant parts that they're giving the greatest input to. Okay, but this all adds up to a perspective. Do I have one more minute, Jess? Okay, good. Which is, look, on the one hand, you hear people being like, AI is going to kill us all and destroy everything or create nirvana. And on the other hand, like, there's very few productivity gains. Everyone's afraid of a bubble. So what is going on? I would argue that these are actually two sides of the same coin. That when we separate the digital systems from people, we make them dangerous because they don't have the feedback to, maintain homeostasis. And also they are not useful because they're not integrated into production processes and human participation. And that by bridging these, we can make things both more productive and less risky. And we'd love all of you to get involved in this. There's so many academic problems to be solved here. We're working on building systems like the social media one I described for Blue Sky and other platforms. We're working on trying to have sort of neural networks be a way that people can understand democratic processes and creating legitimacy around that. We're working on bringing AI into democratic deliberation in politics, and it's been quite influential in Japan recently. And if any of these interest you, please check out Plurality Institute or Plural Technology Collaboratory, or reach out to me at glenweyl@microsoft.com. Thank you.
Now we talk, right?
Yeah.
Turn on my mic. Can y'all hear me? Yeah? Well, thank you so much for that presentation. It was really interesting. I was saying before the event to get like a proper walkthrough of what you've been working on. As friends, I hear about it in bits and pieces, but it's nice to hear the whole thing. I have a bunch of questions, and I think some of them fall under the heading of asking for more specificity, and then some of them fall under the heading of invitations to elaborate.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll start with the specificity ones. And I was curious, try to get you to talk a little bit more about your concept of intelligence, like how you're thinking about what intelligence is. And you have this very capacious definition that you introduced in the beginning with the Gaia concept and this idea that our social systems are already intelligent and our natural ecosystems are already intelligent. And I guess I was curious whether you could define how you're defining intelligence, and speak to whether do generative models have anything to do with how you're thinking about it? Are they relevant in the development of how you think about it, or secondary? I don't know if you speak more to intelligence without giving away anything that happens past the midpoint of the wild.
I think I can move on from that. Yeah. So and sorry to anyone who's not even at the midpoint, and I've ruined it for you. Maybe consciousness is a word I would pivot to a little bit. There's a literature on something called integrated information theory, and it tries to define a notion of consciousness that need not apply to a human. It could apply to any complex system, and it has to do with sort of the degree of capacity of the system to monitor its own functioning and to therefore like check and balance and respond to incoming things in a way that is like concerning an internal logic rather than just the entrance of the external force. And I don't think that's 100% sharply defined in all circumstances, but that's something of what I'm talking about. And there's other notions of intelligence that are like focused on sort of achievement of some goal-oriented thing that I find not very useful and not really something that I think we should be after anyway. But just to give you an example, a lot of literature in complexity science says that like life actually emerges sort of to the extent it has a teleology to dissipate free energy and lead to the heat death of the universe more quickly, which is like not a particularly great thing to achieve. And in the process of doing so, it creates these sort of, self-perpetuating, eventually conscious systems. And so I think like saying, how do we get quickest to some pre-specified goal is not actually quite what we want. We want sort of the richness and self-awareness that comes with maybe having a goal in mind temporarily, but thinking of the idea of creating something that achieves goals per se is not a very good frame for it. To answer the second part of your question, like how do I see generative models or foundation models, whatever you want to call them, playing into this? I think they could be an amazing tool for enabling people to have better collective social self-awareness. I think it's really hard for people to keep track of all the different social interactions they're a part of, to translate across them, to foster cooperation across people from very different cultural milieus. And these models could be really powerful in that because they're able to capture a degree of social complexity that like simplistic systems like democracies or hierarchical corporations don't capture, because they have this recombinant structure, which is really the way that society is structured. And so I think that's really exciting. But if we instead view them as this external agentic thing, then they'll undermine the very systems that they're meant to be mapping and therefore act like some kind of clear cutting of the social fabric.
Yeah, there's something really interesting to me about this idea of intermediate goals being really important, because you did talk about the value of sort of translational formalisms that let you identify something you want to optimize for and make it tractable. But that kind of operation being very important, and yet the sort of heat death of the world, Freudian death drive is how I can't help but think of it as a humanist version of a telos being not good or desirable. That's an interesting tension. I guess I had another question that's sort of...
One analogy I have to use in this is a hike. So if the point of the hike is the hike, it's not getting to the top. There's all kinds of other ways you can get to the top and you hardly spend any time there. But if while you're doing the hike, you're focused on the fact that it's about the hike rather than about getting to the top, you probably won't enjoy the hike as much. So I think of ends and means as having this sort of circular and interdependent relationship that I think is very important.
Have you read Rahel Yegi's new book, Progress and Regression?
No.
You might find it interesting. We'll talk about that. This is related. I was thinking you had the slide where you put up, I think you had the Emperor with No Clothes and the sort of common knowledge idea, and then you had Benedict Anderson and Nancy Baim, these other texts that have been central to how social theorists or critical theorists or culture scholars think about community. And I was curious about how you think of the medium of community, right? Like, to me as a literature scholar, the Benedict Anderson book, for example, is all about the rise of the printing press and the novel and the newspaper and these sort of very specific kinds of textual media that circulated for reasons that had to do with what he calls the fatal diversity of languages, with reasons having to do with the print capitalism, I think is what he calls it, that circulated and gave rise to this imagined collectivity. And I was curious whether community, as you're thinking about it, is this a version of the last question away, but is there anything specific about the medium of social media. Anderson makes a big deal of how nationness was not something that existed before a historical point, and then it did. Like, did the forms of community vary historically depending on the medium in which they're articulated? Or
Yeah, I
is
mean,
there something that
I
transcends
think there's
that?
some challenges with Anderson's
Yeah, me
account in
too.
various ways,
Yeah.
but I do very much think the medium is critical to this.
Mhm.
And the reason is that um, like the different media have different thickness of what they're able to communicate. So I think currency on its own already creates a very thin kind of community.
Mhm.
And maybe things like voting, as they become possible on a broader scale, create a little bit thicker community. And bureaucracy, as that becomes possible, creates an even thicker community. And sort of interactive broadcast media of various kinds create more thick communities. But the thicker they are, the harder it is for them to spread over
Yeah.
all those different diversities. And so I view, the goal of digital technology, to the extent that it is a telos, is taking that trade-off between richness of interaction and depth of community and breadth and diversity of people who can participate in it, and so pushing back that frontier in various ways.
I wanted to ask a question about the experiment with, I think it said it's polis in English, or one of the experiments you talked about,
Yeah.
where I believe what you said is that the social medium or the interface like shows people what communities they're part of, whether they know it or not beforehand. Is that right?
I mean, it's more primitive than that.
Yeah.
But what it does is just on the topic at hand, it
Mm-hmm.
clusters opinions. It does make you aware of what is the cluster that you're a part of, but it's topic specific.
I
I think
see.
a richer system would be more what I would call Zamilian in design, which is to say it would make you eventually aware of the diversity of communities you participate in rather than just on this topic you're part of this cluster.
I see.
But yes, polis is a primitive thing starting to go in that direction.
My question, I'm not sure whether that obviates my question, but I'll ask it anyway. My question was how opinions get clustered, or what I was going to ask is how the label is generated for what community one is part of. I might be part of a Harvard community, part of a recovering Catholics community, part of a mom community. Like, how do the labels, either in the actually existing system or in an ideal system as you imagine it, get generated?
Well, that's already happening in a much more sophisticated way than in polis in the back end of X's algorithm. They've disclosed that very clearly.
Right.
You can't actually get access easily to what communities it is classifying you into, but they're very useful to advertisers targeting you. And whether those are fully accurate or consensual, and that's all a really interesting and challenging set of questions. And this idea of classifying people into relevant communities is at the core of how all of these
Right.
social media engines, to the extent that they're even as transparent as X is about it, work to generate the energy. And what I would say
And
about
so
them
how do you
is-
do it for something whose KPI is not engagement-driven advertising?
Yeah, the way I think about it is like being social media doesn't necessarily mean it's pro-social media. It could be anti-social media. And the way I would classify those is imagine that the social fabric is like an ecosystem. You can clear cut that ecosystem and use the energy that it's created to do something else. Or you can say, actually, the regeneration of the ecosystem itself is the end goal. And I think that's a matter of targeting different things. But I think one element of renewing community is creating collective self-awareness rather than exploiting the social relationships people have to achieve something else. And that, I think, requires some of the transparency and labeling and so forth, as well as directly engaging communities as participants in the process.
And is there evidence? Is there evidence from the Polis Project that people like this? They like being told about their communities?
Yeah, whether they like being told about all of their communities or not is a complicated, not completely sure about that. But it's certainly the case that Polis has managed to get people to take effective political action together in many circumstances. And that people who go through the process of that, Taiwan is now ranked number one in the world for the feeling of civic empowerment of 16-year-olds. And I think most people believe that the digital civic participation infrastructure and education system in Taiwan is pretty central to achieving that.
And since you brought up Simmel, Georg Simmel, the early 20th century German sociologist,
Huge influence on my thought,
that's so interesting to me to learn. How do you think about enmity and community, or like outsiders and community? Simmel writes about this, and I feel it's a big theme of a lot of canonical sociology, that community is created through opposition to an outside.
Absolutely.
So how do you factor that in? I did a study with a grad student once where we found that, through a procedure I could talk about, but that people who hate shared content from outside their community, who shared something explicitly to say, we hate this thing, were like almost 4 times or 400% more influential than people in the network who never did that, for example. How do you factor that in to thinking about this process of making community and making it more transparent?
Yeah, so I think...
and thickness versus thinness.
So central to me in all this is this notion from Lipset of cross-cutting divides. So to me, the beauty of the Simmelian multiple identity view is that it reconciles enmity with solidarity by recognizing that we are part of many different communities, and that while each of those might be defined around enmity, that we're connected to others by shared enmities in enough ways that you can stitch a society together into a whole, as long as you don't allow one of those enmities to dominate all the other enmities. So the enmities can actually be helpful as long as they're sufficiently diverse.
Plural.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that a lot of the problem, and actually writes about this in his comparison of qualitative and quantitative individualism, is that because in the past we haven't really had effective technologies to allow us to help us code switch effectively, to understand all those different contexts we're a part of, we have a tendency, when we feel isolated by the complexity of our social environment, to default into one caricatured vision of our own, enmities, and therefore to end up both isolated and polarized. And that's, again, how I think technology may be useful to us, because by allowing us to understand the social complexity in which we're embedded, it can avoid us falling into that trap. But of course, it can also do many other things. But it's a matter of how we exercise our agency.
So one way that foundation models could be useful is for modeling these sort of more complex, or providing more complex maps of belonging and haters.
My good friends, Pooja Olhaver, is about to write a blog post that will come out soon that I think will be quite provocative to people, in which she this foundational principle, talking to everyone and recognizing that everyone has some things on which you're going to be very sharply divided from them, and some things on which you're going to be in solidarity with them against some other very sharp divide. I think that's pretty important to my, worldview. So
I'll look forward to the online beef on that. I think I'm told we're ready for questions, right? I imagine there are lots of them. I think it's my job to call on folks. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, and the sunglasses.
Here, could you wait a moment? Sorry. Okay. Glenn, thank you so much for your brilliant insight and for sharing your human intelligence, which is unique considering we're discussing superintelligence today. The world is not always flat. Do you think today there is a notion of using the categorical imperative to use in the East or the West more? Or do you think we're at par, considering there are a lot of exogenous factors and we're not always dynamic economies?
yeah. Well, precisely because the world isn't, thank you for your question, but precisely because the world is not flat, I don't think it's a matter of more or less, it's a matter of how and in what ways. And I think that there's a bunch of features of the tech ecosystem in Asia, I would say somewhat generally, but I think the China case, which dominates the Asian case, is a little more complicated, so I don't want to speak too much about that. My experience is more with Taiwan, Japan, India, places like that, which I think is much healthier. There's much more social integration. For example, technologists and scientists in those contexts actually tend to be more religiously observant than the rest of the population. So it's a very different relationship between sort of tradition and cultural groundedness and technological development. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. Wins, I don't think, is the relevant question. If you're racing to smash into a wall, the person who wins is the person who swerves at the end rather than the person who hits the wall. The race dynamic is quite the right way to see it. I think the steering dynamic, who has the most tuned steering system and who's able to integrate the technology most completely socially. And I would say, in some ways, I think India is probably the leading example now in the world of doing that. So,
thank you so much for your talk. I'm pretty curious about how I come from a local government and kind of state government perspective, and seeing if governments are using the superintelligence kind of factor of like mixing technology with dealing with communities and building community. Like, how do you market it in a way? How much transparency do you create for stakeholders and community members about the use of technology, and how like you show that process of showing this integration versus how much of it is kept on the back end? And there's obviously some transparency about the disclosures, but to use it in favor versus like more quietly as a way to improve these processes, if that makes sense.
First of all, I would really refer you to Danielle Allen's project on here in Massachusetts, which is trying to help local governments, especially in Massachusetts, integrate these types of participatory tools. I think the question you raised is a very important one. So it's very easy if you just give a lot of transparency for it to do nothing for anyone. Because unless the transparency is targeted very precisely to what is decision relevant for that person, it just becomes information overload and people default to the least transparent systems. I think that was what was so effective about the Kaizen system in Japan. So the Japanese production in the middle part of the 20th century was driven by informing line workers about the overall production process and how their task related to it in such a way that they were able to do on-the-ground innovation to constantly improve. That was a very careful balancing act, because you can't educate every line worker about everything that goes into making a car. So you have to take a bet on what are the most important and relevant informations. And this is a bet, that kind of a bet. It's a very limited, targeted, just a few logos with a few labels, bet on the notion that situatedness within social communities is central to your thriving as a person. And that could be wrong, and if it's wrong, it will distract people and not achieve something. But that's the bet. And I haven't pondered in these contexts precisely what's relevant to local communities. But one thing I would emphasize is that there is significant investment by communities, including local governments, in communication, public radio, local newspaper, et cetera. I would incline to say that as people move towards consuming things in digital formats, shifting that investment towards things that bring that community together in their digital native experiences, and allowing communities to have the agency to do that might be a more productive way for achieving the goals of community common understanding and cohesion. Just to give a very concrete example, there's this thing called, periods. When you go to build your house, to improve your house, you have to give notice for someone to object to your plan. And the way that's currently done is you put it in a newspaper of record. But the number of people reading that newspaper of record at this point in the way that it's distributed is so tiny that it doesn't actually achieve the goal of creating awareness so that someone can object. And so thinking about, given the way that people are actually currently getting their information, what is it to create common understanding in that community so people could discuss that thing, I think requires being thoughtful and dynamic about this. And there's actually a lot of money that goes into those kinds of things, but that could be adjusted to different formats.
I think Jess was going to do some from the chat.
A question from Joseph. He says, thanks for the talk. I'm wondering if you can speak more to whether the friction involved in democratic processes e.g., the town hall meeting, has a place in the collective intelligence you mention. Put another way, when you speak of targets for optimization, what does a fully optimized community look like?
Thanks so much for the question. I want to be clear, and I think this hopefully came out in my conversation with Moira, that optimization is sort of a necessary evil of building any system that can, do something, and also it should also be always seen as an evil. There's a great quote from famous computer scientist, I forget his name, he's a British, that says, "Premature optimization is the root of all evil." And I think that's exactly right. Optimization needs to be the sort of feedback loop where we do something, we build something based on some optimization, and then we step back and realize what are all the limits and problems with that way of that frame for approaching the problem. And as a result of that, I don't think there is one answer to what's a fully optimized community. In fact, I don't think there ever can be, because I think as we create new forms of interaction that are modeled on adopting certain elements of our understanding of community, we in the process create new community and therefore change our own understanding of that and then have something else to imitate. So I don't think optimization is ever something that one can use the word like fully to refer to. Like one image of technology that I think is common but mistaken is that we're all on the surface of an earth and we're discarding falsehood to get down to the inner core of truth at the bottom, the core of the planet. And instead, I would encourage us to think of we're on a planet and we're building trees. And those trees are growing outward into the infinite abyss beyond the planet. And as they grow out there, they terraform the place around it. They create atmosphere and life and whatever. And the danger is that they lose touch with each other in the process and can't pollinate. The goal really is to create enough cross-pollination between all those branches so that they can continue moving out and continue filling us with the sort of wonder of the emptiness beyond rather than the certainty of having reached the core of truth.
Hi, my name is Moritz. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is about, basically in your talk, you painted this picture of the community, and then each member of the community might have a chatbot that they communicate with. Or there might be this kind of intelligence that supports the community. My question is, if we look into the future where maybe a majority of interactions within a community driven by bots, or a majority of community members are actually not humans, but bots in a social ecosystem on some form of community. How does that change your notion of how the community should be run? Should we basically discriminate between just humans and non-humans in a community? And how does it change the information sharing and decision calculus within a optimal, not optimal community? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be a mistake to get too ontologically caught up on whether some particular system constitutes a separate conscious entity or not. So let me give you an example. There's animist traditions, including Shintoism, where there are spirits and consciousness associated with natural features like rivers. There's other traditions where that is at best a metaphor. And nonetheless, I think having an LLM sort of do environmental sensing and offer an interface with the river that allows us to have a better sense of what we need to do to maintain its health, and even, possibly representing that river in some kind of negotiation or deliberation could be very valuable. Now, is that river a consciousness or not? I don't know. I think representing a bunch of bots that are separated and made by human hands as entities, rather than as, the Lorax. I often use the term Lorax.ai. Lorax is this mythical Dr. Seuss figure who speaks for the trees. I like that vision a lot more. That's very much more consistent with the way that people approach things in Japan, that there can be stewards for various common pool resources, whether they be digital common pool resources or physical common pool resources, and that an LLM might allow us to have a more effective communication with them. And I think that's a very humane and desirable future. Having a bunch of bloodless, robotic things, if that's how we perceive it, floating around, I don't think is, and then us having to grapple with their consciousness or not, is as desirable.
Honey, we have a problem of the mad billionaires, right? People who get enough money that they are surrounded by people that just say yes and never push back on them, and they become psychotic monsters. And it seems with AI, sycophantic AI, we have the possibility of turning everyone into a mad billionaire. And it seems to me that what you've been talking about here somehow might help address that problem, but I can't quite connect the dots. Can those dots be connected? Or like, how do we solve the mad billionaire problem?
Well, I think community has always been something that's helped us avoid madness. I think that's the reason that people have religious communities or universities, and there's a lot of ways that being alone in a basement, being fed things that cater to you, can induce psychosis. And I would submit that having, for example, a chatbot that is perspectival, it's not, a floating disembodied consciousness, and it's not your personal sycophant, but instead reflects some community that you value being a part of, is a way to stay anchored to something. In that sense, I do hold out some hope that it might be useful for that.
I think we have a good ending question. Oh, no, I guess we have a few more minutes, but I'll throw in another question from the online audience. In thinking about wise engagement with, have you thought about the unique forms of intelligence which humans possess, although they often seem to be unaware of, and AI systems will not achieve, which is heart intelligence?
Thanks for the question. I would start by saying that I am somewhat skeptical of anyone who is too confident that they know precisely what the distinctions between human and what's possible with machines is. I think we've been surprised by that many times, and I expect that we'll continue to be surprised by that. And, surprise and wonder and, beauty like that are great things. They can be frightening, but they also are incredible teachers. And I think the thing that worries me most is not any particular encroachment on something that's allegedly uniquely human, but that humans retreat into a stance of protecting and defining themselves by some preset set of things that's supposed to be uniquely theirs, rather than seeing that they have within them, what in my tradition we would call Tselem Elohim, the image of God, and looking constantly for where that's reflected. What is it that they have uniquely to give, given everything? And that adaptability, that constant, thriving in flux, I think is an incredibly powerful capability. And I hope we won't lose that. And I hope in particular that our digital systems don't make us feel that we are just useless now, and instead actually highlight all of the unique elements that we are able at any moment to contribute, and help us be aware of those. And I don't know what they will be. I don't think we can know for sure in advance. But I also think that a lot of the things that we reify as being the things that are unique to us, they're never going to be an artist like this or whatever. Those are actually often ways of people who are in current positions of power reinforcing their positions of power, rather than actually being open to the possibility that maybe it's actually the fact that, for example, in Africa, there are more different languages than anywhere in the world. Maybe it's unique languages that are going to stretch the models the most. And the people who have the least intellectual property rights, who are the most marginalized from current society, will turn out to be the most important. So I think we have to be constantly alive to that and not entrench ourselves into a particular defensive posture.
Hi, thank you so much for your insights today. I want to ask specifically about the third dimension of your plurality project that you mentioned, which is integrating these solutions into our democracies. And with the focus maybe on America, I know with the v Taiwan case, a lot of the credit of that success could be maybe, dealt to their civic tech community, which our country doesn't really have as much of a built out infrastructure of. And instead, we do have a lot of really powerful private companies that, as you mentioned, seem willing to engage with some of these solutions. Do you see the state's role as being independent? Should we be maybe hiring engineers to be coding these projects? Should we be partnering with private vendors of these projects? Should we be looking at universities? Like, how do you actually see these solutions coming to be in America today?
Thanks for the question. That's great. Look, we have one great tailwind going, which is that people are not happy with the way that things are, and there's a lot of disruption. And in the past, one of the greatest challenges for me in this work has been the self-satisfaction of everyone in the United States and the sort of extreme conservatism and desire to just circle the wagons of whatever people assume is the definition of democracy. And that's not true in Asia. There's no profound religious commitment to them having found the perfect system of governance. As things are disrupted, as I think many of those Asian experiences come to be viewed as maybe a more positive potential future than the one confronting us, the more openness I hope there will be. But in terms of how you get it started, I don't think there is one button to be pushed. I think there's cultural change that needs to happen. I think there's political change that needs to happen. I think there's a change in the business ecosystem that needs to happen, and so forth. And there's research that needs to be done. And all of those things are symbiotic and interdependent on each other. And in some ways that's, sad, because you'd like to just press a button and fix everything. But on the other hand, I think it's wonderful because it means that everyone here is an agent. Everyone is empowered from wherever they, start to be part of a flywheel that creates a different culture and system of meaning making. And I don't have time to talk about it too much, but if you look at the book, I've brought a couple of copies with me. We have a whole chapter that's devoted to, like, given where you're situated, what can you do, to be part of that. So.
Great. Thank you both so much. Give it up for Glen and Moira. Thank you. It's been great to have you here. And thank you guys. This is the end of our fall speaker series. So I don't even have anything to market to you. Thank you for coming out. Alex would like to say something.
I would also first like to thank Glen and Moira for a phenomenal conversation and conclusion to the speaker series, and mostly just to thank Jess Weaver for being the driving force behind this whole series. Like, amazing work. And I think the room speaks for itself. Like, it's always full, and thank you, Jess.